Today's guest is Fran Hilton-Smith, coaching legend, football trailblazer, and fearless voice for women in sport. She didn't just change women's football, she laid the groundwork, paving the way for every women's football club in South Africa today. Basically, there would be no Banyana Banyana without you, Fran. Welcome to Cheers to Failure.
Thank you very much. I'm really honored to be on your show.
What made you say yes to having a conversation about failing? Because it's not a topic that people want to get into.
That's true. I've never ever experienced having to talk about failing, but it certainly is a massive part of life and a reality. And it really got me to think of failure and how it affected my life and how it contributed to where I am today.
Yeah. What is failure to you?
Well, it's stumbling. I think it's a stepping stone where you fall down, but you have to get up and continue climbing those steps. You can't let failure dictate your life. You have to learn from it, and I firmly believe that you only learn from your mistakes. And that's been my motto with regard to failure.
When you think about young people today and how they are growing up with social media and all of the influences that set us up to think there is one version of life, it's a perfect, photographed, Instagrammable version of life. What do you wish the young people could know? Because this reality is not true.
True. I think that everyone will fail. There's no escaping it. And I think the most important thing in our modern society is for the youngsters, the youth, to realize that failure is a part of life and you have to learn to cope with it. With our youth, I think there's so much stress nowadays, so much pressure from social media. And it's important to try and help the youth to realize that it's just one stumbling block and you've got to move on and get over it and keep struggling to succeed. I think that is just part of life, and it's important that we help our youth not to be overwhelmed and have mental issues about it.
Yeah. When I think about the role you've played in football in South Africa and in the continent, I wonder what moments were frightening for you, where the stakes were high and maybe then failing was not an option.
Well, for me, I think, referring to football, which has been my life, is failure was certainly a part of my football life, because once we got back into world football in 93, we were suspended because of apartheid for 20 years. Once we got back into football in 93, started with the women's national team in the new era, of course, we expected to do well and win and be successful because we were South Africans and we were great. And of course, the first big stumbling block we bumped was, of course, Nigeria. And of course, we failed to beat them. And we failed to beat them for another 19 years. We failed to beat them. We just couldn't overcome them. And it was only in, I think, 19 years later that finally little Janine van Wyk scored a goal and we beat Nigeria. So, but I had to learn in all that period to cope with this failure, and it was extremely difficult. But I had to think of ways of trying to stop that. And it taught me a lot of lessons. And for me, one of the big things at the time was I realized that to stop failing against Nigeria, I had to make our players better. And how was I going to make them better? Nigerians seemed to be born strong and physical, and they just overpowered us in every way. And our players were not really physical. Like if I look at one, Nampumelelo Nyandeni, is a little girl. Linda Motlalo, they're slim little girls. So I thought, well, I've got to look at other aspects to make them better so we don't fail. So I started now 25 years ago, a high performance center for our girls where they could come in and live there and eat good food and have good nutrition and have sports science and have physios and have schooling, etc., to get over failing or trying to make us better so that we wouldn't fail. And certainly that paid off because now we're the African champions. In my life, I never dreamt we'd be the African champions. It was like this dream there in the distance, and we were always failing. So I never thought it would come true. But with learning from the failures and making decisions to improve, we managed to overcome those failures in specifically football. And now, I mean, when we talk about Nigeria, failure is not in the picture anymore because we've beaten them. We can beat them. We have beat them. We will beat them.
Yeah. I can imagine psychologically having been defeated by one team several times, that psychologically the players and even the coaches and the management team would begin to build a narrative that makes it feel like, I mean, guys, it was just meant to be. They will always defeat us. They will always be stronger. They will always outsmart us. So mentally, what did the team and yourself need to say to yourselves?
Well, I think you've raised a very important point there, was mentally the players were like, there's no hope. We're never going to beat them. We're always going to fail. And another aspect, which you remind me of, was where we had a massive problem and added to the failures, was that, I don't want to particularly mention names, but seeing as they were the most prevalent ones, was Nigeria would always come with players that were over age. So when we played in our under-19 team, for instance, who became the under-20s, I had fantastic players there, like i.e. Portia Modise, who is still one of the top players ever. And we'd come up against the Nigerian under-19 team, and you could see straight away there was no ways on earth they were under 19. And the trouble was when the girls would sit after the game and chat, you know, our players, specifically Portia, who doesn't keep quiet, would say to them, actually, how old are you? And the girl would say, oh, I'm 24. What's the problem?
The script is
we want to go to the World Cup, so well, what's the problem if I'm 24? And that made it even harder to lose when you knew that the players were old. And there's nothing you can do about it to this day. There is no test in women for gender age. In the boys, they can do an MRI scan on their wrist and it shows average age.
Okay.
But in girls, you can't do that test. So even up to now, you can't test if the girl is 20 or 18. So that compounded the failure for us because there was nothing you could do about it, and it was very frustrating. But again, we had to just find other ways of not failing against this kind of situation by being faster, by being better, by being quicker, by being more tactical. We had to overcome the failures, and we did.
Would you say in your role you've learned to see an athlete who is behaving like they're defeated before they start?
Yeah, I think it was just almost a natural thing because we were always losing, to have players coming with a no-win attitude. And I had to, and that's why the women's teams were the first to get in a sports psychologist. I brought in a sports psychologist way back. Nomsa, I still talk to her all day. She kept me sane. to motivate the girls and work on their self-belief. So that started in football, and they fought me at the federation. Now, why do you want a sports psychologist? You don't need that, and the coach must motivate and whatever. And it was a struggle, but I managed to get in a sports psychologist, and funnily enough, in recent years, even the men got in a motivational person to come and motivate them to be successful. So it's a part of life nowadays to work on the mental aspects.
Yeah.
Because we've realized over the years that a lot of your failures are in your head.
Yeah.
And you have to get over that and learn to think positively.
Yeah. You talk about keeping you sane as Fran.
Yep.
What were the things that kept you up at night when you were thinking? I can imagine as a trailblazer, you are doing a lot of firsts. You are having to introduce concepts like a psychologist that other people in the environment aren't open to. So when you are having dinner at home or you are tossing and turning at night, what would be the things that would keep you up at night?
Sure.
Too many.
There were so many. That's why I wrote a book to write down all these things. But yeah, it was very difficult. I mean, if I look back to the beginning, the 93s, when we got back into football, the women nobody was keen to have women's football. That was for sure. It was seen as a hassle. It was a man's game. What do these women want? And even when we started playing, the women got the old Bafana kit. We didn't have kit, so we were given a kit, and the girls were running around with Dr. Gumala on their back and shoes and whatever. They didn't, and those things I felt was a failure on the part of the federation, myself, the sponsors, to not be providing. And those kind of failures prevailed throughout my career in football, and still, even up to today, things that really kept me awake at night was, for instance, with Banyana, they would get at the beginning of the year new boots from the sponsor, Nike or Adidas, whoever it was, new trainers. But then after every camp, the stuff had to go back to the kit room. They couldn't keep it. It would go back to the kit room. And then when we'd come for the next camp, that shoes and boots were used by the boys' teams.
Sure.
Under 20 boys and under 17 boys. And the kit as well, the kit would be used by the other teams.
insane.
And then the girls would come back and have to wear the stuff now that had been worn by other people. So it was for me a failure, but a failure I couldn't solve, really. It was out of my control. It was something that the federation, the sponsors should have looked at, and was a persistent fight throughout my career in football to get women to be given, for instance, which we're still busy with it, is a kit that fits the woman, designed for women. I mean, people used to always fight with me and say the girls look like boys and what's going on. But when they're walking around in men's kit all day, of course they're going to look like men. So these were failures that were, as I say, out of my control on the side of the federation, the sponsors, and it's not just South Africa. This was a world problem, that women's football wasn't taken seriously enough to provide for them equipment that was suitable.
What did you need to believe in order to keep going?
Well, I had to believe that it would change. You've got to be positive. You know, I couldn't say to the girls, yeah, well, this is actually not on and rubbish and we must all now fail because we can't have what is required. So I had to always be positive and make a plan. I always had to make a plan. So eventually what we would do is after each camp, we'd hide the boots away in my office so that the boys couldn't get to them, or the trainers, or I'd have to go and speak to the sponsors and say, look, we really need to have something that is woman specific. Like, for instance, sports bras.
Yeah.
The sponsors never made it. Adidas, Nike, they didn't in the day make these things. And they were basic necessities for the girls to have sports bras because it provided them with comfort and to perform better. So it was a failure all round not to provide these basics.
Do you have a failure that appeared to be the end of the world, catastrophic at the time, and in retrospect today you look back and you just think that failure was a blessing in disguise?
Yeah, I think along the way there's been many failures, and I think, as I said, promoting the success of the team and the wonders of having women succeeding. Like, I think a big role model example in my life was the US women's soccer.
Oh, yeah.
Where soccer is the
Yeah.
national sport.
Yeah.
And I used to, fortunately, from early days, 2001, I was appointed by FIFA to come and work for them as an instructor and doing the World Cups, the reports. And I traveled the world, especially America, the big football countries. And I saw there how successful their players were and how they'd struggled. And I used to come back from America with pictures of the women and show my players that, look, this is where you can be if we don't give up and we just keep going. So although we were failing here to provide the basics, others were getting it, and we had to focus on the positive of that. This is where we must get to, despite all the hurdles that are put in our way. And that kept me and the girls going, I think, was the big picture of where we could get to if we don't be overwhelmed by the present conditions and failures.
Yeah. And in talking to the American football team, as much as they appeared to have been a few steps ahead of the South African team, what did you understand were ingredients that helped them to have some things right?
Well, definitely, I think even it came down to policy, was that they had way back then the statutes changed in America where things became 50-50. So they passed rules in government that if a sponsor came in for the men's team in soccer or football or whatever, they had to do the same for women.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, that was made law.
Oh, really?
Back in the day. So that assisted them incredibly, and it was something that started me then fighting when I came back home to have gender parity in sponsorship and whatever. And look, it's been a struggle. It still hasn't happened in most of the world, really. And it's only in recent times where they have decided and that the men and women must be equal in, let's just talk about football, because that's where I come from. And countries like England and Norway, even the men came forward and said, actually, no, the women must earn the same as us. It's only fair.
Yeah.
So these kind of countries that were more advanced gave us hope in the darkness that there was a light, you know.
So if you were to think about the ideal sponsor today, what kind of, I'm an executive in my other job, and I always just think, what more conviction do people need to participate in women's sports in a way that is progressive, in a way that resets what we've gotten wrong before? What would you say you've seen? What kind of sponsors have you seen get things right and be fair and listen to what the needs are?
Well, I think it's changed a lot in recent times. And I remember, in fact, it was about 98 or 99. I was in the USA and they were sponsored by Nike at the time. And I remember going to a launch and suddenly they brought out a specific boot for women. And I thought, but this is crazy. I've never seen this in my life. And I remember it was Julie Foudy, or one of the big American women, had their own boot designed for women with a different instep. And I was finished. And I thought, this is just unbelievable. And they were trendsetters in bringing in women's design, sports bras, etc., which we'd never seen. But it took many years to try and get this to become a norm.
Yeah.
And it still isn't a norm. I saw just the other day, an American girl again, because they are like the example of how things should be, with a pair of Adidas boots that had just been designed for women. But my thinking is, why has it taken, since the first Women's World Cup in 1991, why has it taken so long for brands to do this? But if you look at how things work, and you would know coming from that world, is generally these businesses are run by men.
Yeah.
And they don't think of these things. I mean, one thing I always remember, and I failed at it all the time, but it was out of my control, was when we used to go like to either Nike or Adidas, the big sponsors who sponsored football, to discuss the budget. And we'd go there and they'd say, okay, we've got, say, just off my head, we've got 10 million for football. And all the big people would be in the room, whatever, and they'd say, okay, we've got 10 million for football. So let's look at the list. Okay, Bafana, right, Bafana, 8 million, right. That's it. Okay, what's next? Okay, under 23 men. Okay, well, let's give them so much. And then Banyana. Okay, let's give Banyana 500,000. And I'd say, but listen, guys, we need...
In what world?
We need the same as the men, and we need more. We need sports bras. We need specific kit for the girls. They can't be playing in the same kit as the men. And it would be this fight. And then it would say, oh, now the money's finished. And I'd say, but we've still got the under 20 girls and the under 17 girls and the under 20 boys and thing. And my high performance center is part of the football.
Yeah,
and
it's
they're
funded.
getting
It's
nothing.
funded,
And I can honestly say, which was a failure I couldn't fight harder against, was the high performance center and the under 17 girls and under 20 girls never got their stuff. They had to share.
Yeah.
So it was not a failure on my part. I felt like it was, that I wasn't winning this fight. But I was up against 30 people and people who didn't believe in women's football, or that there should be equality and specifics just for the women. So on every angle, you had these struggles that you had to try and overcome.
Yeah. So, you know, the thing that I kind of started to do to paint the picture of how important the funding aspect is to appeal to men who are raising daughters.
Exactly.
Because, you know, or men who have nieces who are into sport. That conversation is one that could maybe start to shift how they think. What would you want that CEO, CFO, CMO, who is male and prioritizes funding male sport, to realize about the loss as it pertains to their daughters and their nieces? Yes,
you've raised such a valid point. I think that in recent times, there's been a lot more focus on the woman and what they need. And I think also where we've seen a big change is we have in big companies, sport, business, you an example, we have women coming through who are competent, who think more about women. And if I can give an example of a life-changing moment, was Sasol, the big petroleum, had sponsored for 8-9 years I'm a glug, the men.
Yeah.
And suddenly at Sasol, a woman came along, Nolita Fakudi, came along as the big deal now in Sasol.
Yeah.
And she came and they said, okay, now we're talking about sponsoring I'm a glug, what? And she said, no, I don't think so. She said, I want to sponsor Banyana. And everyone was like, what is going on? And she stood her ground, had the power. And for now 16 years, Banyana had Sasol sponsoring them, and that was thanks to a woman. So that also made me change a lot of things in my life. And one of them was when I started coaching, I was the only woman. There were no women coaching in this country. And I had to start my coaching. I trained with the men, Shakes Mashaba and Trot Malota, and I had to keep up with them. They were not giving me any favors. But luckily I was a very good football player then, and I could play and compete, and not on a physical level, but I was good at football, so I got accepted. But other women were not. So as I got on in my career, I decided I'm going to train women to be coaches, because that's going to change the whole thing as well, because the women coaches are going to fight for women's kit and women's this and women's that to compete on an equal footing. And so I took former Banyana players who'd now finished, and I trained them to be coaches. Then all their licensing, the Desrays, and Piwi, Dlu, Maud, Kumala, the list is endless. And 25 of them now have the CAF A license, which is more than the men in the country, more than any country in Africa. They have a CAF license, and all our national teams now are coached by women.
Oh, brilliant.
And the leagues, the Hollywood Bets, you've got the universities have women coaches. And they now fight for women's rights, where before you had men in doing it who weren't worried, as you're saying. It's if you've got a daughter or a child, like I always, when I go to FIFA or used to travel and meet the president of FIFA, he's got 3 or 4 daughters. So he is inclined to fight more for the woman because he has kids. And it's such a valid point that having girls in your family gives you a different perspective, and you can understand how it's so frustrating when they're not given the basics that belong to them and make them more feminine.
Yeah. Let's talk about the value of the people around you, in as far as the support you get, the counsel you get, and just the listening ear when you are dealing with so many barriers as you are advancing change. What role have your tribe and your inner circle played?
Well, that's such a valid point. It was very frustrating for me when I got in. I worked for SAFA, the Football Association, for 20 years. But in that 20 years, they didn't want women's football. That I can categorically state. It was a hassle, it was a cost, it was an irritation. Fran was always moaning about everything that she wanted. And therefore, I basically fought alone. In the 20 years I worked there, I worked alone. I had no PA, no secretary, no lady making me tea, no nothing. I worked by myself in my little office, and I was the team manager. I was the coach at one point. I was the head of department. I was the manager of the High Performance Center. I became the technical director for a while.
Wow.
For a week, I was even the CEO.
Oh my God.
And I did all this alone with nobody appointed, because I think most people hoped I'd go away and get frustrated. But I decided I wasn't failing. I was not going to walk away. I was going to do this. I had to take SAFA to court at one stage. We had the Picard Commission, who found they hadn't supported women's football enough. We used to write to Nelson Mandela. I've still got the letters complaining about women's football. Steve Chwetti complaining, until there was investigations, the Picard Commission. And it was funny, after these dealings with Steve Chwetti, in 2019 or something, I was awarded the Steve Chwetti Lifetime Achievement Award for what I'd done in football. So it was quite funny. But in that time, you were talking about support base. I had my little tribe who would support me. And funnily enough, a lot of them were men.
Oh, really?
Who were working like at SAFA, like Shakes Mashaba.
Sure.
Let's take him, for instance.
Yeah.
Molefi and Seki. They would come and sit in my office at work, because they all worked there, and come and talk to me and motivate me and keep me going. It was mainly men who were there. So that was my little tribe. And then, of course, all the women who had got into football at the time, like, for instance, Anna Manati, she's still in football. Mary Jane Sokela from Durban Ladies.
Yeah.
They were my support base, who I would bounce things off, and always had my back. It was important. And a big thing in not failing is to have people who have your back.
Yeah.
And women who support you, because as you well know, and I learned in my life, is often women are the first to stab you in the back, because they want to climb that ladder and someone has to fall down for them to get on the ladder. So choosing your tribe was crucial. And lucky for me, my tribe were very supportive and kept me sane, because it was an endless struggle of trying to keep things going when not many people wanted it to keep going.
Yeah, and in that time within your tribe, what questions were not helpful? Because when there are moments where somebody asks you a question, you're like, the question you're asking me right now is not really helping. Are there moments where you recall kind of almost managing what the voices were saying external to you, because of how important the journey you are on was?
Yeah, there were lots of moments like that. I remember specifically when we had to travel, like to Nigeria. Per se, that's always the hot favorite, Nigeria. When we used to travel there, you just had to accept what was going to happen. And I remember sitting at the office after many of these trips and complaining about the treatment we got, and that they'd give you a little bus for 20 people, and we were a party of 30, with our equipment, with our food and water and all the stuff. And I'd come back and complain, and I always remember President Olifant then, Dr. Olifant, saying to me, "But Fran, that's Africa, my girl. That's Africa. You've got to accept it, you know." And I used to think, why must I accept this? That we get there with all my little girls, and you'd get in the bus. I remember the one trip with my under-19s, and we rode for 9 hours through the jungle thing to get to our place where we were staying. There was no water, there was no electricity, there was nothing. The girls couldn't sleep. We had to go and get buckets out the river to wash and whatever. And of course we lost it, went without saying. And when we got back in the bus to go to the airport, It was a 1-hour trip on the highway.
No.
Yes, I wrote
So
about it
all
in my
of
book.
that is just
It's
to
mental,
mess with your mind.
mental thing, mental. And I'd come back and complain, and that's the answer I would get to my ear. But that's Africa, friend. And I'd say this is not correct.
Yeah.
I mean, the nightmares we went through traveling and trying to play in Africa. I remember one day we were also in Angola or Nigeria somewhere, and they took us to train, and it was on the beach, and there were still landmines from the war thing. Or we'd go to a field, and you're training, and the next thing, all the cows and sheep come to graze, and you've got to move around. And you get told, but you must accept this kind of thing. But it led to our failure.
Yeah.
And it was often out of my control.
Yeah, it's like the system is sabotaging
Yeah,
you. And
yeah,
all the
exactly.
chances you have to face that.
But we faced them, and look where we are now. But it
Yeah.
was not an overnight success. It was years of planning to not fail. Like, for instance, in the Banyana team now, when they won the WAFCON, 14 of those players came from the High Performance Centre.
Oh,
And beat Nigeria and Ghana and became the champions. But it wasn't just an overnight success. It was years of planning with the girls being in the centre to overcome anything. And with perseverance, it happened and it's paid off.
Yeah.
But it was a struggle.
Yeah. As we wrap up, I want us to talk to a young Fran who is out in the world somewhere and is maybe looking to succeed in engineering or something else. What would you say to that girl about their processing of failure and all the barriers that are going to come their way?
Right. I would say to that girl, which has been my philosophy in life, is never give up. Nothing is impossible. You can be whatever you want to be. And I think that's what, when I do motivational speaking or whatever, I say to the ladies, girls that are there, is I tried everything in my life. I was a soccer player, I was a rower, I was a motorbiker, I was a top musician in Basadi Women of Jazz. We played for Nelson Mandela. We played overseas. I believed that I could do anything. And that failure was not in my vocabulary. It was a step.
Yeah.
And that's what I would say to any young girl, is you can be whatever you want to be. Engineer, anything, a pilot. You've just got to believe and not accept failure. And you will achieve what you want to do. I achieved what I wanted to do by not giving up.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much, Fran. You've got to believe in whatever you want to do and not give up. That is Cheers to Failure with Fran. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please won't you do me a favor? Click the subscribe button as well as the notifications button so you know when we've got new content on our YouTube channel. And share it with your friends, whoever you believe needs to know that failure doesn't mark the end, but is filled with beautiful, glorious lessons we all need to have. Thank you.